So, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Asian jumping worm and what it is looking like in 2025. For those of you who are unaware, this is an invasive species that a lot of gardeners are very concerned about right now, and we have some idea that it's being found in places we don't want to see it. So this program is intended to help people understand what they might be up against, what they could expect for the year, and what we are beginning to learn from them as we gain more and more information about them. So just a little bit of background information here so you know what we're talking about. The Asian jumping worm is a little unique. It is not a single species like most of the invasives that we talk about. It is, in fact, a group of species. So normally we see members of genuses Amenthus and Metaphyri here in Indiana, though this can vary depending on region. For example, I believe if you go over to Illinois, it's actually a complex of three different species. I think they only share maybe one or two of the ones we have over here. And this varies, like I said, over region. So if you go all the way over to the eastern coast, you may be dealing with a whole different set there. However, I will say that one species, one known as Amenthus agrestis, seems to be one of the more common ones. And that's perhaps the one we get the most often here in Indiana. Now, one of the questions that I often get, and I was actually talking about this quite a bit recently within the last 2 weeks, I was actually giving a talk yesterday on it as well. One of the questions that we often get is, when did this arrive? When did we get it, and why is it spreading now? Well, as best as we could tell, the Asian jumping worm, this complex of species, has actually been present in the United States for probably over 100 years. And the reason we can say that is we can look at historical record from greenhouses and similar locations who actually report finding the worms in their soil. Most likely, it was accidentally shipped here with a variety of plants from Asia and other parts of the world, and it never really took off. Now, unfortunately, our climate is warming. We share a lot of our materials because we're good gardeners and we're good landscape people. And unfortunately, our best habits kind of contribute to this worm's survival and its ability to spread. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind as well is that we often think that worms can provide us a benefit depending on what we're growing and where we're at. However, Asian jumping worms, unlike other earthworms, do not provide any benefit to soil or anything else that we are interested in. They have, unfortunately, nothing but negative qualities, and they do not give us anything in return. So in order to understand why that is, we first need to understand the difference between Asian jumping worms and what we often refer to as our native earthworms. Now, there are several things that you need to understand about our native earthworms first, however. One of the most important ones is that in North America, there are very few native species, depending on where you are, especially if you live in an area that had glaciation occur during the Ice Age. So if we're talking about here in Indiana, we had glaciers cover a significant portion of the state, not all of it, and those glaciers basically stripped the topsoil away. And then the native species of worms that would have been in that topsoil were made extinct because they were just stripped away. The worms that we have now, those are actually species of European worms that we introduced during colonization. We brought them here in plants that we brought from the old world, and we also brought them in the ballast tanks of ships because what ships used as ballast back then were rocks and soil. And they would dump their ballast when they reached our shores, and thus the worms were set loose in the North American continent. Unfortunately, a lot of our native worms can be displaced, or quote unquote native, I should say, can be displaced by Asian jumping worms and damage their environment pretty severely. And this creates a lot of concern. For those of you who may not be as familiar with it, these European worms do us major services in terms of aerating our soil, providing or cycling nutrients back into it, and helping gases and liquids exchange with plant root systems. Now, if we use our example here of a European night crawler, This is a pretty ubiquitous worm that we all think about. This is one that maybe you fished with before, or maybe you found many of them on your property just crawling around after a rainstorm. We're going to use this as kind of our example worm to work with when we talk about things that we do want to see. So some factors about the European nightcrawler first. This, like many other kinds of worms, is a surface feeding worm. What they do is they consume leaf litter from forest floors and other locations, and then they have a burrow that's deep into the soil around the root systems of the plants in that area. They'll burrow down and they'll drag their food from the top of the soil surface into that burrow. That way they can feed safely, they can lay their eggs and do whatever they're going to do. And this is also what creates those channels for aeration and water movement. This is where we're getting that benefit. The worm's castings, or their poop, they're called castings in this case, are very, very rich in partially digested organic matter. So they're adding in all of this organic material that's already partially digested, which means it's already halfway to where we want it to be, so to speak. It's going to add a really good structure to the soil. It's going to make that nice, thick, loamy soil that we want to see. In a garden or a farm setting, this is great. We like this because it makes the soil much easier to work with, and it really, really makes plant growth very, very easy compared to not having them. It actually took quite a long time to convince farmers that the worms were going to be good for their soil, and that was only got done through the work of organizations like an extension service and research scientists, and farmers really only adopted that practice in the last century. Now, that being said, my work generally takes place in forest settings. And if you go to a forest setting, even the European earthworms aren't good in those situations because unfortunately, that same activity increases the chance of erosion and kind of makes it harder for forest understory to develop. But that's a different story, neither here nor there. Now, a little more on our native earthworm, quote unquote native earthworms, I should say. So the species, all species of earthworms that we're familiar with, they're also called annelids, I should say. They possess both male and female reproductive organs, so they are hermaphroditic. However, European worms still need a partner to be able to reproduce. So worms will mate with each other and then they will lay packets of eggs. Sometimes they're referred to as cocoons that contain up to 10 eggs, and they'll lay 20 to 30 of these cocoons per year. In a very ideal situation, an earthworm can live up to 10 years. But when we say ideal, we're talking about a situation in which they're developing probably in a lab. Out in nature, worms are food for a lot of organisms, including birds and insects and all kinds of things. So getting to that 10-year mark would be pretty incredible for a worm. So I've told you everything about the European worms. Now we need to understand what the difference is between the European worms and Asian jumping worms. Where does the problem come from? Why does it exist? First off, it's the ecology of the worms themselves, how they live that causes a problem. Here I'm giving you a picture of what soil looks like after Asian jumping worm has been through it. And let's dive into that a little more. So first off is where they are in the soil. So I told you European worms create these burrows that they live in where they can drag food from the surface and then pull it into their burrow to feed. However, Asian jumping worms tend to live right on top of the soil, never burrowing more than an inch or two down. And what they do is they consume the leaf litter and wood material that's rotting right on top of it. So they're not creating a channel to help root systems gas exchange or help water flow. They're just eating stuff right on the surface, and all their castings will remain on the surface. And then when it comes to the castings, we said European worms will partially digest their food, and it's going to help put nitrogen and other nutrients back into the soil. That's going to be really great for plant growth. However, Asian jumping worm castings don't break down at the same rate. They lock in nutrients very, very well, which means oftentimes those nutrients won't re-enter the soil system because by the time they would have enough time to do so, they've probably already been washed away by some hydrological event like a rainstorm. And oftentimes you'll just lose those nutrients in the next nearby water source, where a pond suddenly turns green after a rainstorm occurs. All the nitrogen got washed into it. That can be the fault of many things, including Asian jumping worms. And then I showed you this picture. This is what those castings look like after Asian jumping worms have been through. Instead of creating good, healthy soil with good organic structure, you now have something that's dry and has the consistency of coffee grounds. Let's do a quick comparison as well. So this isn't two pictures, this is one picture. I put the red line in the middle of it to show you the difference. On the left-hand side, that is ground where Asian jumping worm was present. You can even see, if you look at the shape of the soil, you can see some of the little ruts that the worms made when they were crawling through it. But the soil has a consistency of coffee grounds, and there's very little material on top of it. Whereas just a few inches away, the soil that they had not yet gotten to, you can see it's covered in all kinds of plant material and other things that are breaking down naturally and putting nutrients back into the soil system. You could probably begin to guess what the problem is here. You are losing ground. You are losing usable ground to these worms. So the soil that's here doesn't allow for a lot of things to grow in it. In fact, the kinds of plants that grow in really adverse conditions tend to be plants we either classify as weeds or are in fact invasive species themselves. And this can just add fuel to the fire. Now, a little bit on the reproduction and life cycle of Asian jumping worms. This is where things begin to really get a little hairy. So, the adults of Asian jumping worms only live for a single season. The adults and the young cannot survive our winters. However, their cocoons, their eggs, can survive fall and winter here. The environment that they come from is very, very similar to ours, making it so that they're very well adapted already to what's here. The trouble is that the eggs, the cocoons that they're in, are very difficult to see. They have a shape and a size that's vaguely reminiscent of mustard seeds. I've only seen one paper ever written about ways to identify the eggs of these things, and it was written, I believe, by some researchers at the Wisconsin Arboretum. And folks, I am an entomologist. I specialize in very tiny things, and I do not feel like I want to try to take on that particular challenge. It is very hard to see them present after a lot of soil sifting. Now, once the eggs begin hatching, you're looking at temperatures that are going to be above 50 degrees Fahrenheit for probably several days at that point. And once the eggs have hatched, the adults will develop within 60 days. So that means that you need to be within spring. And right now, we've been above 50 degrees pretty consistently recently. So these eggs will start to hatch. Now, a few other things about Asian jumping worms. While they are not suited to our winters, there are a few issues that we have discovered when it comes to our gardening practices and how these worms have adapted to them. One of those issues is that the worms will automatically gravitate to sources of heat as the temperatures begin to change, and they will lay their eggs in those sources of heat. And if you are doing the right kinds of practices that you should be doing when managing compost, your compost piles will be warm throughout the entire winter. And it is not unusual for me to get a call about adult Asian jumping worms being found in as early as February, coming out of compost piles. Normally, adult Asian jumping worms shouldn't be seen until the end of July, but we are finding them here in Indiana as early as February. I have already this year gotten reports of worms being found in a variety of things, including bags of soil. So they're definitely active. Now, the worms themselves are also far more prolific than your usual European earthworms, because while European earthworms need a partner to reproduce, Asian jumping worms can reproduce asexually. They can essentially self-cross like a plant could, and they will begin to give birth to essentially their own daughter clones. This means their populations can explode very fast. However, we've seen that they tend to go through boom and bust cycles where they'll have a huge population development, they'll eat all the food that's available to them, and then the next generations will kind of severely drop as their food resources are limited because it was all eaten by the previous generation. And then they'll just come back after a couple of years when the plant detritus is built up enough. Now, we are also adding into this that we are getting temperatures increasing due to climate change and other effects. So what this means is that we are now getting several generations of worms per year, potentially. I want to make clear, though, that this needs to be researched more to have a better understanding of it. And I'm hoping that we can get people to get that done so we can give you even better information as time goes on. Now, the important parts. One of the big questions that a lot of folks will have on their minds is how can we identify these worms? If you look at them and you're not familiar with worms, you probably have a hard time telling them apart. But thankfully, the traits to tell them apart are fairly easy, and you should be able to do it without needing a special tool like a hand lens. One of the first things that we look at is Asian jumping worms tend to be exposed to the sun. So they tend to be darker on at least one side. They're going to be more melanized to protect themselves because they sit on top of the soil. So they're not burrowing down. They are going to be in the sun quite a bit more. Length is not something that I have found to be reliable. Some people have said that they tend to be larger than European earthworms, and I have just not found that to be true myself. It depends on what age you're finding them in, and people don't generally know how to age their worms appropriately, how to guess how old they are. So it usually relies on a specialist to tell you that. So I wouldn't rely on length. Asian jumping worms, however, are very aptly named. They jump, they thrash around. They will thrash around like a snake if you handle them. This behavior has undoubtedly developed because it probably scares away birds, and it makes it so that predators are much less likely to get close to them. So if you have a worm that is just writhing around like crazy in your hands when you pick it up, you most likely have an Asian jumping worm. Another thing that is not listed on here is that the worms tend to congregate en masse. So European worms tend to be found singly. Asian jumping worms will have a large group of them on the surface of the ground. And oftentimes, say if you're going through forest understory and they've been released into the woods, you'll find just masses of worms out in the middle of the woods eating all of the leaf detritus. However, you may be worried about them being in a garden. Your chances of getting large numbers of them may not be as high, so you may not necessarily see this happen. The best way to identify them is the position and structure of an organ on their bodies known as the clitellum. And this is that image I just showed you, where I've got this red circle that's showing you that clitellum. This is the organ that contains all of their reproductive parts. So if you are looking at it on a European worm, you are looking at something that's going to be vaguely saddle shaped. The little cuff that this organ looks like will not fully encircle the body, and they will tend to stay the same reddish brown color that the rest of the worm's body is. However, if it's an Asian jumping worm, you're going to be looking for a cuff that does fully encircle the body. And it's going to be really just nice and flush up against all the other segments. And it's going to generally be more pale and smooth compared to the segments around them. That being said, I have run into instances when I've been identifying the worms and I discovered that that clitellum color doesn't really change until they become adults. The clitellum is present, but it'll be the same color as the rest of the body, but it will appear smooth. So that is one mostly reliable way I have found to tell them apart. It's probably the safest way to. There are a few other things that you can look for, and here I just kind of list all that information. So that way, if you're watching on YouTube right now, you've got that screen. You could pause right here and check that out. The other feature that you could look for is what are called setae, or the bristles the worms use to move through the soil. So if we are looking at setae on things like the European worms, generally European worms only have 8 setae or 8 bristles per segment. And those are arranged in very, very specific ways on the segments. And we can use those as a diagnostic characteristic to figure out which species of worm we're looking at. However, Asian jumping worms have a full ring of 40 bristles on each segment. This is why they're able to move around so easily and jump so much because they can just grip onto everything very easily and move their bodies around. And if you're very careful and you're really good with a hand lens or a microscope, you can actually see these as they kind of exert them out of their body to grab onto things. If you're able to look really closely at this picture, you could see a very pale line down the center of the segments that I've kind of pointed out here. That pale line are the pores through which those bristles come out and grab onto things. And it's just like little stiff hairs. They're not like claws or anything like that. And that's how they move. And it makes them very, very mobile. Now, with that being said, obviously, one of the big questions people are going to have is how can we prevent Asian jumping worm from getting to us? This is a question that I have been getting a lot lately, and I usually get quite a bit around the spring season. And we are still developing good practices on prevention. So I'm going to tell you the basics of the information that I've got so far, and we'll go from there. So first off, you have to understand Asian jumping worm is not a regulated organism. The Indiana DNR, which is a regulatory body, does not have any laws that allow it to label it as an invasive species and eradicate it. So since it is not regulated, that means it is perfectly legal to sell them. And you will find them being sold under names such as Alabama jumper, crazy worm, wood eel, snake worm, and all kinds of other ones. And you can commonly find them at bait shops, businesses that do vermiculture, and others. You can even find on websites people who acknowledge that these worms are known to be invasive, but they disagree with the fact that they're not useful in soil. And they'll tell you that they will really, really help out soil. This is not true. Asian jumping worm will break down your soil quality given enough time. You are better off getting worms that are European worms or some variety of native if that's even possible. So if you are going to buy worms to use either for fishing or whatever, make sure that you could be told what the species name of that worm is and then verify that that's a species you want around. If you can't do that, you do not want to buy those worms. You also need to keep in mind that these worms can invade through contaminated soil, mulch, and compost. And I have had several community gardens tell me that they have outbreaks of these worms because they were bringing in compost from various sources around their community to help them out. When you are transplanting live plants, consider using bare root stock as much as you can. Now, keep in mind, I know that that is a challenge in and of itself because let's face it, if you plant tomatoes, you're probably not planting bare root tomatoes. You're probably getting a transplant or you're growing from seed. What you can do is you can wash off questionable soil. The worms don't care about the plants. They want what the rotting stuff on top, all the rotting plant material, so washing off the soil is possible. I'm going to go over that a little more shortly. Make sure that you are using your own compost. Do not trade compost. If you do have to buy some, you could do what's called solarization, where you can leave it out in the sun for a few days until the internal temperature of whatever it's in reaches 105 degrees Fahrenheit. After that point, the worms and their eggs can't survive and it should be safe for use. And avoid transporting soil to your property. I know a lot of us, especially if we're in a rural community, sometimes someone will be kind and bring us a load of soil to put in for a new garden that we want. It's very common practice. And right now, that's just not one we can really engage in until we know that the soil you're getting is safe and you're not going to introduce something you don't want. Now, most of the reports I've ever had of Asian jumping worm have come from compost piles, almost guaranteed. Now, there have been increases, and keep in mind, this is anecdotal, there needs to be research done, but there have been increases of reports I've been getting about people finding them in landscaping and finding them in bags of soil that they have bought. So you need to be checking soil in bags, potting medium, whatever. However, you're looking for medium that already has nutrients in it that could house worms. Things like things that are more like stone, things that are more like vermiculite or perlite probably aren't going to be as much of a concern as actual just potting soil. I mentioned landscaping. I have had several landscaping professionals, particularly around the Indy area, call me to tell me that they have been finding these worms around mulch. And like I said earlier, if you are doing best management practices for mulch and compost, that means that you are keeping it internally warm through the winter. And the worms will take advantage of that. They will be able to survive and keep going generations through the winter season. This is an unfortunate thing, and I don't want to discourage you from doing your best management practices when it comes to your mulch or your compost, but you do need to be aware that introducing different sources could potentially cause an infestation. Now, detecting the worm, I've already taught you or showed you how you can identify them, so I'm only going to say a little bit about this. Check near the surface. They are not going to burrow very far down at all, if they burrow at all. If you have a large infestation, you may see them grouped together en masse on the surface. Mainly, you're looking for soil that's going to look like coffee grounds. That's going to tell you if the worms are present. So you're looking for soil that's granulate. It's going to be drier. It just will not look like loam. It won't look like sandy soils. It will have its own particular appearance. If you are in doubt, you could do what's referred to as the mustard test, where you mix 1/3 of a cup of ground hot mustard seed into a gallon of water, and then you slowly pour that over a 1 square foot area. This will irritate the worms and force them to the surface. However, it will force any worm to the surface, not just jumping worms. So you'll have to actually go through and identify because you're trying to figure out if they're present. Generally, I would say use that as a last resort. Use the other things first to try to figure out if they're present, and then maybe consider doing mustard tests in different places if you're just trying to get a larger scale look and you're picking random spots in the yard or the garden to figure out if they're present. All right, eradication. This is where things get hard because unfortunately, since these are not regulated organisms, that means that there are no chemicals labeled by the EPA for use on Asian jumping worms. We have some evidence that they will respond when they are exposed to treatments that are intended for other organisms. However, you can't legally spray for these. You can't put anything in the soil. And on top of that, you risk doing a lot of damage that you may not want to do if you do try to. I have seen so many people try to use home brews to eliminate these worms, and some of the things that they have created are making chemicals that are really dangerous to the people using them. They're not going to help your soil, and it's just a very, very bad idea. So please do not homebrew some kind of treatment for Asian jumping worm. The best thing to do is just pick them or shovel them out of the soil if you're finding a mass of them. You can put them in something so that way you can heat kill them. Sometimes I've suggested soapy water left out in the sun. It's not going to be very pleasant to look at, but it will do the job. Spreading mulch or compost on the driveway and hand picking the worms is possible, but you will have to still contend with the egg cocoons. And on top of that, if you spread it out, the worms could escape. They are moving organisms, so they can go wherever they want to. Solarization is probably going to be your best option, but you have to make sure whatever soil, whatever compost or mulch you're using has to be fully enclosed, which means it has to be in like a clear plastic or a black plastic bag and allowed to heat up. If you don't fully enclose it, again, the worms will just crawl away when they sense that the environment they're in isn't safe for them anymore. Now, this part is something that I know a lot of master gardeners and people with garden associations or clubs may have some problems with. You want to make sure first you're not sharing plants from known contaminated sources. That's just common sense. You need to monitor all plants and all soil and materials coming into a community garden. If something is potted or someone's bringing compost, you need to solarize it or check it. If you are looking at a potted plant, I kind of went over this earlier, take the plant out of the potting material or potting soil, wash off the material. Remember, the worms don't want the plants or their roots, and then put it in new medium. The potentially contaminated soil you can then solarize, and as long as you reach above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, you're good. You can add it back into the system. You should be just fine. Um, and I kind of went over that in the next slide, in the next PowerPoint bullet point there, so I don't need to repeat it. The last thing I would do, and this is especially intended for our master gardeners who are in the audience, please educate your communities. You've learned now how to identify them, and you can also report them using a variety of different websites. And I believe I have a slide here coming up shortly. It's going to talk about that. So first off, I want to make sure that I show you the Purdue Plant Doctor. This will help you identify them. This is not an app. This is a website that you can look at. It is intended for use on mobile, so it works really well there. And if you need help when you're out in the field working with these, I made sure that the pictures of these worms are on there so you can easily identify them along with symptoms and other things to help you get at that identification. And if nothing else, you can always reach out to me. This is just a good starting point. And what you do is if you look at this page that you'll land on when you go there, you just type in a problem that you have, or you can go through the pictures by clicking these buttons or tapping them, and you'll be able to get to what you're looking for. Now, as for reporting, normally I rely on a website called EdMaps. Some of you may be familiar with it, www.edmaps.org. It's a great website that lets you report a finding of an invasive species, and that report, if you add pictures to it, will be double checked by someone. So that way we know that's legitimate. We also have GLEDN.org, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. This one uses an app. I prefer EdMaps personally, but I've known people who use GLEDN as well, and they have a lot of success with it. Oftentimes, I will tell people to call 1-866-NO-EXOTIC to report an invasive species. That goes for all invasives that are regulated. So things like spotted lanternfly, spongy moth, etc. Asian jumping worm, unfortunately, the DNR just can't do anything with right now. This is their hotline, so if you call them, they'll try to help as best they can, but there's not a whole lot they'll be able to do. So what I would recommend is if you want someone to talk to, email me. And here is my contact information right here. My email is rfbruner@purdue.edu. I also run the Report Invasive social media, and you can find information I publish on these in the Purdue Landscape Report. And you can also learn sometimes about these worms when we have a speaker who's being hosted at the Emerald Ash Borer University. All right, with that, thank you everybody watching on YouTube. If you have any questions, please put your questions in the comments or feel free to contact me.